Hi, I'm Katie Byers, and this is The Zoo Question, a series from Wild Tomorrow about what really happens behind the conservation story zoos like to tell. In this first episode, we're talking about something I call the zoo industrial complex, how institutions that say they exist to save wildlife have become mostly about ticket sales, branding, and balance sheets. If you've ever walked into a zoo and felt that uneasy gap between the glossy conservation signs and the animals pacing behind glass, this episode is for you. When you walk into a wildlife rehabilitation facility, the first thing you notice is what's missing: the crowd. There are no ambient rainforest soundtracks looping over loudspeakers, no gift shop humming in the background. What you hear instead are the small, raw sounds of animals in trouble. A raptor adjusting on its perch, the low whine of a distressed mammal, the subdued crunch of a keeper's boots on dirt and grass at 6 a.m. That's the world I've worked in for years. Not the world of meet-and-greet sloth encounters or photo ops with baby otters, but the unglamorous work of getting injured animals back to wild functional condition, or helping them die as gently as possible when we can't. Once you've spent enough time in that kind of silence, the noise of the modern zoo starts to sound very different. Let's talk about that noise. The modern zoo's pitch is powerful and simple. Visit us, see charismatic animals up close, and you're helping save species from extinction. You buy your ticket, you walk past the conservation banners and the donation boxes, and you're told that the animals in front of you are ambassadors, part of breeding programs, living arcs for threatened wildlife. It's a comforting story. The problem is what happens when you start pulling at the numbers behind it. In North America, the big players are the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, or AZA, accredited zoos. There are roughly 240 of these facilities in the United States, and together they attract tens of millions of visitors every year. AZA accreditation is supposed to be the gold star, the sign that a zoo meets high standards for animal welfare and contributes meaningfully to conservation. But here's the structural problem almost nobody in the industry says out loud. The accreditation process evaluates performance, not outcomes. It checks whether facilities meet certain flexible benchmarks, not whether their work actually moves the conservation needle for wild populations. And on top of that, the inspections happen once every 5 years. 5 years is a very long time in the life of a captive animal, and in the lifespan of a project that's supposed to be saving a species. The flagship conservation program that AZA zoos love to promote is the Species Survival Plan, or SSP. It started in the 1980s and now coordinates breeding programs for hundreds of threatened or endangered species across many institutions. If you've ever seen a zoo sign explaining that an animal is part of a species survival plan, this is what they're talking about. The promise is straightforward. Coordinated captive breeding today will help rebuild or safeguard wild populations tomorrow. That mission isn't fake. There are a handful of genuinely important wins, like work with black-footed ferrets or some high-profile hoofstock. Those successes matter and deserve credit, but those are the exceptions, stories that get marketed as if they're the rule. When you look at the SSP record overall, a different picture emerges. Internal AZA assessments have found that only a small fraction of SSP-managed programs have ever led to successful, self-sustaining reintroductions into the wild. Most species in SSPs are living out their entire lives in captivity, with no realistic pathway back to functioning wild populations. Meanwhile, zoos continue to sell SSP participation as proof that your ticket price is directly funding species recovery. This is where language gets slippery. The SSP is often treated as a reintroduction engine. In reality, it functions much more like a genetic insurance policy for captive populations, a way to manage bloodlines and demographics in zoos, not necessarily a pipeline back to ecosystems. That's not a worthless goal. Genetic insurance can be valuable. The problem is when institutions market it as something it usually isn't. So, what does accreditation actually measure? AZA inspections look at things like veterinary programs, basic welfare practices, infrastructure, staff qualifications, and paperwork. Those are important, but they're mostly about how animals are kept, not whether the institution's conservation claims hold up. A zoo can spend a tiny percentage of its overall budget on genuine field conservation and still pass accreditation with flying colors. There is no hard minimum that ties conservation spending directly to revenue. The result is that a zoo can advertise itself as a conservation powerhouse while devoting most of its resources to exhibits, amenities, and marketing. The conservation badge is real enough to reassure the public, but not demanding enough to force meaningful change. If this sounds like an argument for abolishing zoos, it's not. The argument is that if you're going to claim the mantle of conservation, you should meet the same standards we'd apply to any other conservation project. That means structural changes, not just prettier infographics. At minimum, genuine reform would require things like 1. Mandatory conservation spending floors tied to revenue, so institutions can't quietly starve field projects while building new attractions. 2. Transparent, independently audited SSP metrics published annually, including failures and dead ends, not just the success stories. 3. Accreditation by bodies that are not made up entirely of other zoo professionals with obvious conflicts of interest. 4. Collection planning based on conservation need, not primarily on what drives attendance. None of that is radical. It's the baseline you'd expect for any conservation program that claims to be saving species. You might be wondering, if zoos are this compromised, why do they still feel so reassuring? Partly, it's because they offer something we crave, the chance to see wild animals up close without leaving the city. Partly, it's because they've successfully branded themselves as the moral alternative to circuses, roadside menageries, and trophy hunting. But if the conservation story is being used primarily to justify budgets, expansion, and new attractions, then visitors deserve honest transparency about that. You can love animals, enjoy seeing them, and still ask hard questions about whether the institutions housing them are living up to their own claims. This episode is the beginning of a larger conversation. In this series, we're going to dig deeper into the economics of the zoo industry, the export pipeline that moves animals around the world, and the gap between what facilities say about conservation and what their records actually show. If you found this episode helpful or uncomfortable in a useful way, share it with someone who cares about animals and thinks zoos are the obvious solution. This is a report by Wild Tomorrow, and this has been The Zoo Question. Thanks for listening.